This is the Week in Sustainability from Sustain.Life. It's where our team of sustainability experts and practitioners share commentary to keep you up to date on developing stories and news.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of the Week in Sustainability. I am Alyssa Raid, Chief Sustainability Officer of Sustain.Life, and I am joined today by Chris McClure from Crowe, who is a partner in the advisory service group and is the leader of the firm's environmental, social, and governance services team. Chris has more than 25 years of experience in regulatory and compliance matters, and we're here to talk about a very exciting topic today, the final ruling of the SEC disclosure law. Long awaited, much anticipated. So without further ado, Chris, thank you so much for joining us. And please do share just a little bit about yourself and your work at Crowe for our listeners.
Well, thanks, Alyssa. It's a pleasure to be here with you today and look forward to this great discussion on a timely topic. And as you mentioned, I'm the ESG services leader at Crowe. Crowe is a global accounting and consulting firm. So we work with our clients across all industries to help them with their emerging issues. In the ESG space, we've been working for quite some time to help clients with everything that they're facing from a regulatory perspective, customer requests, industry trends, and all different types of risks and opportunities, that they see around ESG. So certainly we've been anticipating this SEC rule and look forward to talking with you about it today.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for joining. I think in our realm right now, it's a very exciting week. I think we've got a lot of calls, a lot of LinkedIn messaging, a lot of blogs. I mean, anyone who's involved in the ESG or climate space, whether you're a practitioner or in-house or a support service provider, this is a really big deal. And so this law has come out. It was voted on March 6th, right? A 3-2 vote for approval. And the law looks a little bit different than what the initial proposal, which came out almost 2 full years ago, looked like. And I guess a little bit of context for our listeners, right? This initial proposed rule came out on enhancing and standardizing climate disclosure for all publicly traded and listed companies. And there was a lot of, we'll call it pushback or maybe feelings or commentary from the market at large on this. I think the SEC in the end received 24,000 comment letters in not always criticism or support, but just in commentary around the law. And so let's spend a little bit of time anchoring on the high level. What is it that this now proposed law that just has been approved actually requires companies to disclose to investors and for general public disclosure? There are things that happen inside the financial statement, outside the financial statement. So let's maybe orient our listeners a little bit in what those things are, and then also what it really means for companies that have to go ahead and prepare this information.
Yeah, that's a great setup and a good recap of where we are. 2 years ago, the SEC was really out on the forefront of potential climate-related disclosures. And then, of course, there have been many, many times that we thought we were going to get a final rule. Now that we've gotten it, they're in some ways behind the times because we've had so many other regulations that are passed and industry trends have moved so much. So I think that initial 510-page proposal, some of the big things that were in there, the biggest thing probably was Scope 3 emissions. So we talked a lot about that as the SEC referenced in the call is, and as you said, 24,000 plus comment letters of all different types, including I think over 8,000 in the last couple of weeks. So a hotly contested piece of legislation. As I understand it from reading now some of the updates, there's potentially they find themselves in the exciting position of being sued by both sides, by parties on both sides that are not happy with the rules. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go, because there's some precedent for litigation changing rules in the past. But to your point now, what do we have now that they've announced this rule? And I would say a couple of things that surprised people looking at it. One was that Scope 3 emissions were out. That was probably the most hotly contested item. And the reason for that, there's all kinds of criticisms you could read about where it's too challenging to calculate, requires, the input from potentially private companies, not subject to the SEC rule, et cetera. So what we're left with then with the rule is what's outlined here. So, and you've organized it between inside and outside the financial statements, which I think is great. So let's talk about just quickly the key pieces. Climate-related governance strategy, risks, and targets. These are items that we've been talking about for a long time. The precedent for that, or the protocol for that, is really the TCFD alignment, the narrative around that. And then the next piece is Scope 1 and 2 emissions, which I think everybody now is very familiar with, maybe not so much, when the SEC proposal came out, but so much has happened that now we are. And transition plans, scenario analysis, again, things that we've been talking about commonly through TCFD and other reporting requirements. The thing that I'd like to highlight here, and I think to me, the words that matter the most potentially as I was listening to the meeting and I see here is if material. And I think that's fascinating because all this now hinges on a materiality assessment. And so we're going to be diving into that more as a firm. We'll be providing guidance for our clients. I think this is really going to be one of the key things that everybody's going to be asking is how do you conduct a materiality assessment around these topics? Simplified materiality in the context of financial statements might look at financial metrics as a 5% of net income or some other sort of metric. And then you might, you determine materiality that way. However, as we've all heard now, through the proposed rule and all the discussions around it, the definition of materiality that stems from court cases and others is broader. It really looks at a piece of information and the absence of it would impact an investor or a reasonable user or however you want to define it. Very, very broad. So now, as I view it, that materiality review for these issues is really going to hinge on many, many, many considerations, not just the financial cost of carbon that's assigned or the potential for a physical risk, but the transitional risks of additional regulations you're subject to, what your customers are asking for and tying it to your revenue, industry trends, and all kinds of things that are happening. So the if material is the thing that I took away and that we're going to spend a lot of time on in the future.
I love that you focused on that because I think that materiality, for being such a powerful and indicative word and impactful word, it does have these very definitions. And that's something that we're always talking about with our peers and with our customers because everything hinges on materiality. But then there's not really a consistent use of that word, even when you're thinking of financial materiality. And so I agree with you. I think that's a really interesting point to focus on and one that's going to be really crucial in how companies think about making that decision for themselves.
Yeah, it's a customized decision to the facts and circumstances of each company. And what I think is interesting here, and it's something we talk a lot about with our clients in our webinars and things, you need a cross-functional team. You're going to need different perspectives to make that decision accurately because not one person alone may not have all the facts at hand to assess whether that's really a material topic. So again, you're going to get input from a variety of people around the organization to assess that. So I thought that was interesting that a lot of this hinges on if material. Of course, we've got a phase in over time that we'll talk about. So who knows what will be material by that point in time? That's going to change. You're going to have to continually review that based on any number of things that might occur that changes your perspective. So very interesting. And I don't, we'll have to see what the best practices are that emerge around, how to conduct that assessment.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, well, we've already alluded to the phase-in timeline, and this is another thing that had a pretty significant shift from the original proposal to where it landed. So let's spend a little bit of time. One, maybe I'll bucket out first just the registrant type. So this is, again, was pretty different, where before the proposed law, as initially issued in March of 21, applied a little bit more globally to all public companies. And there was a phase-in period, but eventually they all had to do the same thing. And I think the takeaway I get from this is that really the most stringent requirements really only apply to the large accelerated filers. And so we see a lot more of that kind of loosening or slackening as you go down, to the smaller companies. So looking at this timeline, we have a bit of a pushback in terms of when your disclosures in that financial statement need to take effect compared to when you need to start disclosing emissions. And then we can't talk about phase timelines without also introducing that phased-in assurance requirement, specifically, again, for those large accelerated filers, the transition from limited to reasonable assurance for the scope 1 and 2 emissions.
Yeah, that's right. Everything was pushed back. And of course, we have changes given that the requirements are different. So the large accelerator filers are first up. We have fiscal year beginning 2025, not that far away. A lot of companies have already been doing these calculations for other purposes. So I would say the first point is you're going to continue down that pathway as you're assessing all the things you need to do. This will fit in. You may find that this rule is actually less burdensome than other obligations that companies have around these measurements. So, and we'll talk about what's the strategy, the takeaway, but that's really it, is continuing on and getting ready because you're going to have to produce these if material, these disclosures and calculations soon, but it takes you time to build it up, make sure that you understand your baseline periods and that it's good data.
Yep.
And then the point about assurance is really important here. So there's some obligations around assurance at a high level. They talk about two different levels of assurance: limited assurance, which I would say really looks at the data, provides negative assurance. There's nothing there that's obviously incorrect. And so then the distinction there is when you shift over to reasonable assurance, that adds some other requirements. It really looks at the control environment around how the data is created. So again, given that these timelines now are pretty far out, I would say, certainly we're going to watch them. We've talked about litigation, the potential that some of these might change. So we'll be monitoring these, of course, and you'll want to understand how this timeline then fits into your overall compliance timeline that you should be establishing, where, again, you may have requirements for California, you may have the EU that you're looking at, all these other requirements. So this is just another line to build in, to your planning.
Yep. And I know we'll talk about this in a little bit, but when the final rule came out, so much of the dialogue that we were involved in was around the exclusion of Scope 3 emissions. For us, that is so much of where our existing customer base is really focusing on really getting that information from their supply chain and automating data flows. And so much of what we were being asked is, or what we've been talking about is, what does this mean? How is this going to change what you're doing as a business? And what we hear across the board is, it really doesn't have a very significant impact. You're already mandated, many of these larger companies, by CSRD, which is impacting 50,000 companies. You already in the US have California's SB 253 impacting another 5,000 companies. And so many of the customers and companies that we're working with are being asked by their large buyers, we're doing Scope 3 emissions. We need you to report emissions and allocate them to us, on a revenue or a production basis. And that's not going away because these companies are either mandated in other jurisdictions or, frankly, it's become part of their own internal strategy program. I mean, we kind of glossed over this a little bit, but climate risk is financial risk, right? Like climate change is very expensive. If you don't have a strategy to identify your physical and your transitional risks and have an actual business plan in place for how you're going to mitigate or adapt to them, that's going to be very expensive to you. And so I think, when we think about Scope 3, and especially from all the conversations we're having, is that yes, of course, it's as a climate professional, it's a little disappointing that it wasn't included in the SEC. But honestly, it kind of just puts the SEC in a bit of a backseat when it comes to ambitious disclosure. And it doesn't really mean that companies aren't still going to be focusing here because that's clearly where the global baseline is going.
Yeah, no, there's a lot in there. You're absolutely right. A couple of points I'd make. One is, first, going back to the materiality assessment, it's hard to know if something's material unless you measure it. So there's that issue. So even if you're running through that exercise to make that determination, you still probably have to do those measurements to have a credible materiality assessment. And then to your point about just everywhere that these demands have emerged, this global supply chains, vendor bases are connected, procurement obligations, and for all kinds of reasons that you've mentioned, these types of calculations and assessments are being done. And again, whether it's driven by investor requests or customer requirements, direct regulatory obligations, or all the above. So that's why, again, stepping back, we talked about a broad-based ESG materiality assessment. That climate risk is a big one. We work across things like anti-human trafficking and other product compliance. All of those things are emerging in that direction because we're all connected. So again, the CSRD requirements, others are big, big drivers. So the SEC fits in here now. We'll see how this may change over time. We also can't forget that even though this SEC rule is perceived by a lot of folks as being sort of watered down, the SEC still has been pursuing a number of enforcement actions around a very, very broadly defined set of ESG disclosures. So they have a completely different perspective than what there was in the past around the importance of ESG information, again, whether it's climate or anything else. So we have to remember that these SEC obligations, again, are just one piece of the puzzle, but you can't focus too narrowly on that. You have to keep your head up and look at everywhere that you're saying things around climate related issues, because again, we've got enforcement actions and we're going to see people comparing. We've got ratings agencies pushing for information, activist groups that are around this. So there are a lot of eyes and ears on everything that you're doing. So again, the messaging is, having a plan and having a good compliance timeline, but also making sure that you're sensitive to industry trends, peer group issues, and other things that are happening. So it's a multifaceted thing that's going to require a lot of attention and an evolving process for dealing with it, not static. You have to make sure you're on top of it and addressing things as they change.
I could not agree more. I mean, the amount of the pace at which this space is moving is honestly almost astounding. And again, for those of us that this is our profession, we're so deeply involved in it. It's incredible. It's hard to keep up with, honestly, as someone, as a company or as a practice or an enterprise that's focused on this. And so for all of the kind of industry companies that aren't, have the rest of their business to run, we're just seeing the teams and the disciplines really build out and start to focus on this. And exactly as you said, this cross-disciplinary, cross-team work, because this is no longer some siloed exercise of a sustainability team about operations and efficiency. This is truly, this is investor relations, this is capital markets, this is risk management, this is a complete enterprise-wide strategy. And I completely agree with you that companies need to really stay abreast with what is happening in other jurisdictions and other regions, because while there is this intent to harmonize and consolidate, the truth is, in the short run, there's still a bit of muddying of the waters as each of these kinds of laws and jurisdictions and frameworks kind of settles and anchors into exactly what it's going to be. And then, as you mentioned, also what's enforceable. And the other thing I wanted to tap into that you said is really about accountability. So often we are talking to customers about even just carbon accounting. It's not about identifying the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere, right? We do that by other measurements, physically measuring parts per million carbon concentrations. This is about creating corporate accountability and transparency and the way that companies are identifying and managing and mitigating all of these different things. And so I will +1 your comment there on accountability and transparency, because that's the expectation. There are eyes and ears everywhere. And companies, I think, are really maturing to the sense that what you say matters, even if you say it in a place where you didn't think it matters because nobody asked or, was looking with that rigorous of a comb. That lens is changing. And so to really make sure that you are consistent and, understand the impact of the claims and the words that you're using and how you represent your business.
Yeah, that's right. And again, there's different perspectives we talked about just in this short time frame. We've talked about the specific accounting requirements now and the SEC disclosures. There are legal implications here. There are investor relations and marketing type issues. And you have to make sure that all of those align. Whatever you say when in whatever outlet, now, very importantly, it has to be consistent, aligned, and well supported, with data and documentation. So that's the best advice I'd give people going forward: is get the cross-functional team together within your company, push on these things, meet regularly, understand all the stakeholder demands around this, not just the regulatory ones, but the other ones, so that you have a consistent approach that's going to put you where you need to be and where you want to be as a company.
Well, you totally read my mind. I was going to say, what advice would you give to companies that are listening, or what are you engaging most with your corporate clients today in terms of how to best prepare for this? And I think you've articulated it perfectly. This is about getting real. This is about getting serious and really maturing. Don't be reactive, be proactive, be smart, because this is completely going to be integrated and so intrinsic to your core business function and long-term resilience, frankly, as a functioning business unit.
That's right.
Right. Well, Chris, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It was such a blast to have you on this podcast. Don't be surprised if we call you up for another guest session. This was so great, and we really appreciate your perspective on the new rule.
Yeah, no, my pleasure to be with you. It's always great to talk with you and the Sustain.Life, and we appreciate our partnership and look forward to future discussions as all these things evolve.
Awesome. All right. Well, that's what we have for you on the Week in Sustainability. We will see you next week for more news.
Sustain.Life is the leading and most comprehensive sustainability software on the market. To learn how we can help your company measure its emissions and take climate action, go to Sustain.Life. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this show on our YouTube channel or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week.